I went hiking on a trail in Wells Gray Provincial Park 7 years back. It was nothing special, just a new trail I was checking out. I had finished many trails in this provincial park earlier, and I felt confident about hiking them. Based on my research beforehand, I planned to be on the path for 4 days, sleeping outdoors for 3 nights. The starting section was a fairly worn track, but the deeper I went, the harder the path was to spot. I kept going until a few things caught my attention, and I started to doubt that I was still on the right path anymore. I looked at my compass, plus some direction notes I put on my phone during my research. After checking everything, I was totally certain that I stood on the wrong track. However, the map showed no other routes in the area, so I really had no clue where I ended up. I turned around and tried to retrace my steps to try and find the right trail again, but it was starting to get dark, and I feared that I'd stray and become more confused, so I made camp where I stopped. I skipped the hassle of doing a complete setup. I simply laid out my tent and left it at that. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and fell asleep fast. About 6 hours into the night, I woke up, feeling thirsty, and decided to go grab my water bottle from my pack. When I opened the tent and stepped out into the woods, I noticed a glow in the distance. My first thought was, perhaps, someone else had gotten lost too, but the chances of that seemed low. It was also around 3 a.m., so keeping a fire lit during the middle of the night like that seemed very odd. I wasn't going to sleep knowing someone else was out there, and I wouldn't feel safe unless I confirmed they were normal fellow hikers. I figured I'd light a fire of my own, letting them know I camped nearby if they hadn't noticed yet. And if they were up to something, then it would signal to them that I was awake and alert. I lit a fire big enough for them to notice, but not even a minute later, they put their fire out. I froze. No way that was just a coincidence. I waited the night out, checking often for any sign of whoever was out there, but there was nothing else. In the morning, I woke and found my tent unzipped, when I knew for a fact I'd closed it tight. Someone had opened it while I slept. I packed up my tent and got my gear ready, but my curiosity got the best of me. If they were regular campers, maybe they'd know the way back too. I had my gun strapped to my chest, just in case, and walked toward their location. It was empty, but there were clear signs of a fire. There were also multiple footprints all around, and not far off, I saw a small shack, or maybe a hut. I approached with caution and looked inside. The door was left open. The area smelled old and damp, but inside there were piles of camping stuff, tents, trekking poles, bags, everything a camper or hiker might want. Expensive stuff too, not junk. Some of the tents and backpacks were slashed. A few had dark stains that looked like blood. The way it was stacked up, though, it didn't look like it came from just one person, or even from the same period. Some of it looked recent, while some seemed older. I backed away and left quickly. By some dumb luck, I found a massive tree I remembered passing during my hike up. And from that spot, I found my way back to the right trail. I followed that trail all the way back, and got out of Dodge fast. I called the cops afterward just in case, but nothing happened. I suspect they never bothered to go check the location out. I believe whoever was out there had to be robbing hikers by luring them off the trail. Or doing something far worse, the dark stains and all, that I thought looked like dried blood, but couldn't be sure. I can't tell how they managed it, or if anyone they targeted managed to escape, but I think I was close to finding out. Whoever unzipped my tent that night, maybe they were planning to make sure I never left. A few years back was the first time I'd ever experienced anything terrifying on a camping trip. I used to go camping by myself multiple times yearly, mostly visiting familiar locations, but occasionally looking for new places. For this trip, I decided on an old access trail that I'd never been on before. I drove out 3 hours from my house to a remote location where I started the hike. Right from the start, I didn't like the trail much. mostly because many parts were soaked and muddy. Even so, I kept going and did my best to step around the muddy areas. I walked downhill for some time and hiked for several hours without seeing anything unusual. When I was about 5 minutes from the end of the trail, I spotted something just off the path. It was a tent, but very worn down and had a few rips in it. From afar, I could tell nobody was inside it, so I moved closer. There were no signs of any intentional damage. It all just seemed to be weathered over a long period of time. The fact that it was still standing up amazed me completely. I checked around it and inside of it, but strangely there was nothing else to be found. I thought I'd discover a bunch of stuff left behind, but there wasn't anything at all other than the tent itself. After a couple of minutes, I returned to the trail. I thought about it for a while, but couldn't figure out any good reasons to leave a tent like that. When I reached the end, I set up my tent a good distance away from the trail just to be safe. It was getting dark already, so I stayed at my campsite until I was ready to sleep. I felt a bit nervous to go to bed, but I was able to fall asleep without issue. When I got up, it was roughly 3 in the morning, based on the position of the moon in the sky. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, but right away, I could tell something was wrong. I turned around, and on the other side of my tent, a man stood just a few feet away. He was lean, rough-looking, all business. Felt like he was carrying. His right hand was behind his back, like he had something tucked away. He looked at me with this empty stare. I stood there motionless. In the moment I was so shocked and scared, it almost didn't even seem real. He spoke in a soft yet creepy tone, telling me he was sick of warning hikers to leave the area. He told me I was probably the last person he would bother warning. I nodded and quickly began grabbing my backpack, but he suddenly charged toward me. I tumbled backward, and all I could manage to say was okay over and over again. The man towered over me still, with that vacant look in his eyes. He told me to leave again and pointed to the sky, telling me that I didn't want to be here when they land. I could hear a low-flying plane overhead. I got what he meant this time, and quickly jumped up and bolted away, abandoning everything. As I ran away from my campsite, I came across dozens of left-behind objects scattered along the path. All of them were camping or hiking equipment, spread around the old access trail like trash. Nobody would leave everything behind intentionally. This wasn't an accident, I was sure now. Whoever left this stuff behind had gone through the same thing I had. I ran as far as my legs would carry me, then hurried at a quick pace for the remaining distance to my vehicle. Luckily, I had my phone and keys in my pocket, or else this mess could have been a lot worse. I headed out until I got cell reception, then dialed 911. I discovered there was a nearly identical report to my experience. The tent and gear I spotted on the trail probably belonged to whoever made that report. A month later, I learned from a friend who works border patrol that there's a hidden airstrip in that area. They've been tracking drug smugglers who fly in shipments at night. The man was probably a lookout, making sure nobody was around during drop-offs. That's why he wanted me gone before the plane landed. I used to love camping, but after what happened when I was 12, I can't even think about going back. Now that I'm a single mom, the idea of taking my daughter camping freaks me out. Every summer we went camping, just like always. I basically grew up at this campground, been going there with my family since I was a baby. It was the first day of our camping trip that year. Everything felt normal, except this time, I was older and alone. No friends with me. My older stepbrother wasn't on this trip. He sat this one out. His dad, my stepdad, passed away about a year before this trip. My mom had full custody, but my stepbrother was old enough to decide where he wanted to stay. That summer, he stayed with his grandparents instead. It was just me, my mom, and the woods around us. My mom tried, but I ended up spending most of my time alone. I went to the park alone, grabbed ice cream alone. My mom had rules, and we did spend some time together, but mostly I felt like I was on my own. I spent most of my time riding my push scooter around the campground when I got bored. The campground was pretty spread out, not one of those places where motorhomes and tents are packed together. There was plenty of space in between, with lots of trails and all kinds of trees. You get the idea. It was a good spot. There was this sketchy old cabin I passed by a lot while riding around. The cabin was far from my campsite and even farther from the others. It looked abandoned, like no one had stayed there for a while. One day, as I passed by, I noticed the front door was cracked open. I'd passed that cabin a bunch of times over the last few days, and I was sure no one was staying there, or so I thought. Man, I just wish I had never gone inside. Of course, my curiosity got the best of me, and I, ever so slowly, made my way up a couple of steps onto the porch and slowly pushed the door forward. It was so eerie because the door was creaking the whole time, probably for like 15 seconds. It was a very cringe-worthy sound. Out of nowhere, a man's voice asked who was there. I stood in complete silence, eyes wide, and my mouth dropped to the floor. The man, standing right across from me, told me to come inside and reassured me it was okay. I turned to leave, but he instantly shouted at me to come back. I took off on my scooter and rode away as fast as possible. There was nothing that really happened after that. I don't know what he wanted, but thankfully, I never had to figure that out. I went back to our site in a panic. I didn't tell my mom because I was too scared. I don't know why, but the next day I rode past the cabin again. There was no sign of him. I know now that he was definitely trying to lure me in, and who knows what he was going to do. I hadn't seen him again until the second to last day of camping. I was at the campground laundry room, grabbing our laundry for my mom. He came up right beside me and asked why I bailed on him. This guy, I still remember his face. He was really stocky, well-fed, and reeked of booze. Looking back, I'd say he was probably a hermit. He gave me the creepiest toothless smile I'd ever seen, and told me I was a pretty little one. Then, he gave me this weird wink and strolled off. I'd never see him again after that. We left the campground a couple of days later, and I still never told my mom. I don't know why, I just never felt like I had to. That guy was, without a doubt, a predator, and he was absolutely trying to go after me. It didn't work on me, but I hope to God it never worked on anyone else. Now you can understand why, as a single mom, the thought of taking my daughter camping scares the hell out of me.